The potentials of human action, corruptible and a transgression, cast a shadow over the damned. Its affect and enormity of the past can never be erased, only addressed. Through an eternity of regret, acceptance, and forced confrontation of unassailable truths, man is left to endure the irony of his existence. Unable to repent once flesh leaves the soul, fate beyond death lies for those who live a life of vice. Sin is an abstract manifestation of man's own deception, unprompted by none other than the individual who reaps what they sow. And so it's the effect and causality of temptation, decisive fraudulence, impertinence, and violence. As it's understood, sin is the doorway into eternal damnation. The Inferno engages in these varying ideas of the greater or lesser sin, an individual's consequences then weighted by Dante the poet's viewpoint on the separation between such temptations, like the 7 deadly sins. In an overarching context, he contributes an interpretive theological premise for Christianity's hell. And ironically enough, the deeper the protagonists go, the more torment and violence are structured as a banal experience. Though he only gives an abstracted, unimaginable angle on these experiences, he details the fabrication as complex and intricate, which helps to sell the illusion of the conceptualization even more. From this point forward, let this reflection stand as a point of departure for the further exploration of what the Inferno considers to be sinful, and how it's developed as a feasible concept and what its consequences rhetorically communicate about mankind. Past a creation or supernatural myth, Dante and Virgil's journey follow an element of rhetorical irony that acts as one lens or framework for how sin is communicated to both reader and characters. Because hell is conceptualized as a space of torture, something which speaks more to the intrigue of each level's significance is the real-life connective tissue. By incorporating well-known or unknown figures, poets, rulers, and acquaintances, each encounter of a sin leaves a greater emotional scar on Dante. Similar to how he admires Virgil, his encounter with other figures showcases differing feelings over perception of love, or suicide, or fraud. In framing this narrative as a theological basis, both Christian audiences and Dante are capable of viewing each difficult moment as a potential paralleled allegory. Looking at one instance in particular which exemplifies the previous point on irony and real-life connective tissue, looking at Canto 12 as one example of this, with the Minotaurs and Centaurs who launch arrows at any head that sticks out of this river of blood. In life, they committed acts of violence, like drawing blood. So in death, they're left to boil. In consideration for the irony of this moment, even further, this example conveys the idea of a universal rule that Dante has set within hell. Those who commit a certain act should receive a befitting punishment that mirrors their crime. And in a way, they're denied the spare thought of their crime, which is why they should always be reminded of their actions in life. In this similar vein, it's also ironic how the individuals who try to stick their heads up out of the river of blood are immediately stopped by the Minotaurs and Centaurs, as I said before, whose purpose on this level is to ensure that they remain submerged. There's a bit of irony on this. Here we see those who were violent against neighbors, so now they must suffer from forever drowning in that very pool of blood, forced to remain there by these creatures. Creatures one would probably call monstrous. Well, as a human, you've done a monstrous act, so it makes sense that you would be submerged by a monster. What this does is ground a consequence in a literary realm that's feasible to comprehend. While the punishment is severe, albeit not as much as the others, this does establish a contrast between expectations and outcomes. Another way to frame this occurrence is through the term poetic justice, as it relates to karma and getting what one deserved, be it positive or negative. However, one note of discernment that karma lends itself to is more of a natural cosmic happening. Meanwhile, poetic justice is usually phrased in the context of a punishment. What's interesting about Dante's Inferno is how the religious and theological premise suggests this is a both karmic and poetic justice situation. And that's due to the role of a sinner, more specifically murderer or brutalizer, as well as the role of hell in Christianity as the foundation for cosmic order. So in any case, those of this sin shouldn't receive a light sentence, and they should dwell in the suffering they caused to another. You could also claim this is an example of law of equivalent exchange. Moving on to Canto 13, which prompts more of a visceral reaction out of Dante. The suicide forest speaks to the pity both Dante and Virgil seem to express here. Because these individuals who had killed themselves had damaged their God-given bodies and flesh and life, in death, their sin's punishment equates to denial of human form, and now they remain as trees, subject to Dante's ignorant action of plucking apart a branch that harms them as a result. This level is characterized by lamentation. A heavy sense of gloom and grief permeates the canto's tone and language. The fact that these trees are the weeping trees speaks as much to that. In response, Dante expresses his pity and how much he's moved by these encounters. At this point, more so than the previous sections, it shows how much he's been affected by the levels of hell. Even though he's aware of suicide as a sin, he expresses sympathy for the trees. Even Virgil, who throughout the book chastises Dante for feeling pity, doesn't really do so here. He allows him to go through those emotions and listen to the stories and learn of the consequences. Following the same thread, pity is a powerful presence, as it's a repetitive challenge to overcome when dealing with the embodiments of suffering and sin. Even though he knows those people have sinned, he also knows he must not succumb to pity. For one purpose of his journey is to learn from the dead's mistakes, and thus better himself. Likewise, the spiritual hurdle can also run parallel to how the reader may feel alongside him. Some situations can be thought of as purely tragic and not necessarily deserving of their punishment, but to their part, they were involved in an unfortunate situation that was out of their control. On the other hand, some are deserved. An example of this was when Dante recognized one of the sinners and called him out for his arrogance, to which Virgil praised him for. In a passage it reads, "With weeping and with wailing, thou spirit maledict, do thou remain. For thee I know, though thou art all defiled." Although the point overall here is that they should not have done what they did, the point of contention is what is supposed to push Dante and perhaps his Christian audience to avoid this fate by life through to death. Nonetheless, the struggle of mankind to evade sin and damnation seems to be evident in the side-by-side relatable experience along with him. You go on this journey with him, so you are meant to feel what he feels. It perhaps reveals man's propensity or inclination towards sin, and it prompts us to consider it unavoidable. Rather than telling a story of perfect emotional mitigation of pity, suggesting Dante the Pilgrim as some virtuous do-gooder, we're given the realistic nature of Christians and of people, and for that matter to seek liberation from ignorance, to seek avoidance from sin as much as possible, and through this vision quest to come out of suffering and evil better than how you began. Regarding Canto 20, the Malebulge passage is one point that speaks to the harshness of some of the punishments, which really characterizes hell as unforgiving in its irony. For fortune tellers to have their heads turned around, only capable of walking backwards, is simple enough. But for them to have endured so much pain that they are rendered unable to see, once again is testament to the severity of what Dante, the poet's criteria for each sin is. This is the sin of pride being committed, so it makes sense to punish someone for taking the position of an apostle, prophet, or a saint. You shouldn't try to tell the future. You shouldn't try to be clairvoyant. That's not your role. Yet even so, the pain and blindness is an example which harkens back to a previous point about how unfortunate the depth of each deed is relative to one another. Both instances in Canto 13 and 20 are precise moments when the nature of human sympathy and inclination towards pity rings true to man's imperfection. Even someone who rises to make a living telling the future receives such a cruel punishment, according to Dante the poet. It goes to show the lines between religious sin can be few and far between. In Dante's portrayal and characterization of hell, he builds sin up as deserved, but at the same time, according to this hierarchy of his personal viewpoint, seeing as he likely took inspiration from Aristotle's work about ethics, not Christianity in any relevance, since the juxtaposition of malice and fraud seem to have relatively been just as cruel punishments. And God hates malice, but fraud is man's own sinful deception, and therefore malice would make sense to be below fraudulence, right? In the Malebulge of Canto 20, Dante weeps at the sight of his sin, for it's both a revolting sight and paradoxically not as severe of a sin as one would expect in something like malice, or rather the level which dealt with violence and sinners who drew blood. In whatever way you think of this, a fortune teller, just to circle back around, being blinded and walking backwards in pain seems just as harsh as being submerged in a river of blood. But this may be a more subjective take on that matter. To begin to wrap this up here, all aforementioned points of reference as well as an analysis all derive from an inspection of sin as a concept by which Inferno makes it a point to develop. Through each level and the way punishments are handled, hell is communicated as a mirror to life in a way. It delivers poetic justice to the sinners and pays them with poetic justice. Furthermore, the parallel in experience between going on this journey with Dante the Pilgrim and Virgil as a guide establishes a less virtuous and more imperfect point of view to understand the structures of hell. This perspective tugs at Dante the poet's ability to design a complex and intricate system for sin that has its own rules and elaborate decisions. He takes familiar figures just known only to Dante in order to call on previous contexts and associations that further enhance the irony of the punishment, because we understand how they were before. Not to mention a counterweight between a few moments of levity in the punishment, such as the excrement sin with the somber lamentations of the suicide forest, all balance the tone of the journey to being a true challenge for Dante to pull himself through, as he's constantly confronted with these phantoms of vice. And so, in the end, this all characterizes sin as more of a dichotomy of rhetorical devices and these personal ethics of Dante, which may differ from Christianity's more accurate depictions of consequences or hierarchy of sins.